What's up, guys? Harry the Potter here. How's everybody doing? Thank you for joining me for another video. Today we're going to be doing throwing for beginners, 7 basic steps. All right, so today I'm going to go over each step in the throwing process in a really quick tutorial just to kind of give y'all an intro to throwing. So once I got my clay ready, I got my bat, I don't want to just throw it on a dry bat, right? I want there to be a little bit of moisture, but I don't want to unload a whole ton of water onto the bat. So I'm going to squeeze all the water out of my sponge, and I'm just damping the wheel. Now before I get started, when I'm throwing on the wheel, it's all about my body posture and positioning and levering my body to be able to maneuver and push the clay around. Right? And I'm always going to be leaning forward, engaged in what I'm doing. Right? My head is going to be directly over center. My legs are going to be up tight up against the wheel. And ideally, my knee is going to make a 90-degree angle. Right? So that's about the height you should be whenever you're sitting down at the wheel. If you're up way too high, it's really tough. If you're too low, then you really can't get above what you're doing. So posture has a lot to do with that, right? So good posture. And always try to bend from the hips, keep my back straight. That'll save your back in the long run. All right, now some key points on the bat here. I can just explain to you real quick. All right, so let's just say we're gonna cut this into quadrants, right? All right, so y'all are looking face forward, all right? The wheel is moving this direction, all right? This area right here is all off limits. Almost never do I need to interact with the clay on this portion of it. I always am going to interact with the clay at the point where it is leaving me, where that mass is starting to move away from me. That's where I have the most advantage to be able to kind of maneuver and push the clay in the direction I want it to go. So my main points of interest are this 3 o'clock point, which I call my sweet spot, and then this line directly in front of me, right? So in this quadrant, in this zone, this is where I'm going to be doing all of my work, all right? And that'll come in handy later on when we're going through this process. So just remember that. Keep that in the back of your mind. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the sponge in my right hand, I'm going to take my left hand, and I'm going to brace, right? So everything I do, my hands are going to be braced together, and I'm going to be supporting everything. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to gently hold the sponge here in the center of the wheel. I'm going to slowly go out to the 3 o'clock spot along the straight line and slowly back towards center along this straight line. This also, I find, just kind of helps me relax, get my mind in tune with the wheel, kind of push out any other exterior thoughts I may have. The clay really demands my attention. It demands me to be focused and attentive on what I'm doing, right? So now that I got my bat ready, it's nice and damp, right? All my tools are here, clay's ready to go. I'm going to take my ball of clay, throw it down in center. If it's not directly in center, that's okay. All right, but instead of ripping it up and then throwing it back down, which might accidentally cause an air pocket underneath there, I'm just going to gently take it, gently kind of push it in towards center. All right. Once it's in center, pat it down and make sure it's adhered to the bat. That way it doesn't go flying off. Right? And now I'm going to start my 7 steps of throwing. Step 1, most important step, is to make sure you get the clay centered. So the way I do that is I'll take my elbow and I'll put it right inside my hip here. That way it kind of braces up against my hips. And I'm going to use this portion of my hand right here to gently let it glide on the clay, keeping this hand back. All right, I don't want to wrap my hands around it. I want to keep this hand back and just keep the pressure right here. And then I'm going to take my top hand, called the footprint part of my hand, and I'm just going to gently hold it on top. the center. Right? So my hands are going to be in this position, just like this. You notice they're touching, my elbows are braced, I'm leaning forward, I'm engaged in what I'm doing. All right? So what's going to happen is I'm going to push this up, down, kind of like a seesaw. So I'll go in with my bottom hand, clay will rise up. I press down with my top hand, the clay will flow out. So I'll go in and up, down and out. In and up, down and out. And I do this a couple times until I feel like the clay is centered. So, this is it in action. Pressing in with my bottom hand, let the clay rise up. And then pressing down with the top hand, let the clay flow out. Now remember, you want to always continue to add a little bit of water to it. You don't want to drench it in water, just enough that it allows the clay to move freely through your hands. If you ever feel the clay starting to kind of pull on your hands or heat up a little bit, that just means you need to add a little bit more water. So, bottom hand, gently press in, allow the clay to rise up, gently press down, allow the clay to flow out. And then I slowly kind of shorten that movement. And then once I got it centered, I'm going to gently take my hands away, nice and slow. Alright, so anytime I interact with the clay, I want to be careful not to make any sudden movements. Because if I react really quickly and say I jerk my hands away, well, I've affected one side of the clay and not the other, which would cause the clay to get off center. So it's really important, everything I do is slow and rhythmic. Alright, so I got the clay centered now. Step one. Step two is to open the clay. Alright, so I want to create an opening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pointer finger, my right hand, I'll take my left hand, and I'm going to brace close to the tip of my finger. If I'm bracing way down here on my wrist, I have no stability on my finger. I want to be nice and close. Again, always bracing my elbows. And I'm going to place my hand slightly to the right of center. All right, so what I mean by that is, let's just say this is my center line, okay? So instead of placing my finger directly on top of center, I want my finger to hug that center line as I press down. So it's just slightly to the right of it. I'm not pressing directly on center, just slightly to the right, following that center line down as I'm pressing. This will allow me to keep the clay in center. So again, a little bit of water, brace my hands, leaning forward. I should be directly over the top of the pot. And nice and slowly, I'll start to press straight down. Now if you got a little clay coming off from the tip of your finger, that's all right, don't worry about it. You want to keep a little dot in the center, right? So I just have a tiny little dot in the center, and that tells me I know that I'm staying true to my mark. So I'm going to keep going down just a little bit more. Now I know that this is the right depth. I've been doing this a long time. But for those of you that need to test your depth, right, a good way is to take your needle tool. You're going to stick it all the way down in the bottom. And then take your finger all the way to the bottom and mark where it is. And that'll tell you your depth of your base. All right, and this is exactly where I want to be. All right, if it's a little bit thicker, that's great because you'll have some room to trim. If it's a little thinner, well, then you're getting on a little iffy side and you might accidentally cut your bottom out when you go to cut it off the wheel. So I would recommend maybe a good 1/4 of an inch. Step 2 is complete. I've created my opening. Pretty simple. Step 3. This is where I'm going to create the base of my pot. All right. Now this is also a very important step. If I do not have a good stable foundation or stable base, as I go to lift the walls of my pot up, they're not going to be very stable, and it's going to cause me issues. And it also will allow me accidentally to trap too much clay at the bottom so that I'm not able to get it up into the walls of the clay. So the way I create my base is very important. So again, what I'm going to do is take my pointer finger, brace with my right hand, again, close to the tip of my finger, but this time I'm going to hook the end of my finger. So I'm just going to set it all the way down the bottom, hook my finger back, and nice and slow, I'm going to pull straight back towards my hips. Nice and slow. And gently ease up. Take my hands away. All right, another quick note. It's really important. Whatever the original size of my base is, I do not want to exceed that when I create my opening. If I were to do that, then the clay would start to fold over all the way around the edge, and I would potentially trap water or air in there. So later on in the process, it might cause cracking or the bottom to break out of my piece. So again, if I want a nice wide pot, my original center needs to be nice and wide. All right, now I've opened the clay, but I'm not quite done finishing up with step 3 in creating my base. Before I move on to step 4, I want to go back and I want to compress the bottom, right? So the clay is made up of particles, kind of like fish scales or shingles. And right now, they're going in all different directions. And when it goes through the firing process, they vibrate and they want to separate, right? So in order to keep the base nice and solid and keep those particles locked in together, I want them all going in the same direction. So I do that by just applying a little bit of pressure with the tip of my finger. And I'm going to do just like I did at the beginning, where I used the sponge from center all the way out to the right, back to center, but now I'm just going to use the tip of my finger. So I start at center. This doesn't take a lot of pressure, just enough to compress the clay, and slowly go out to that right hand side, that 3 o'clock mark, all the way to the edge of the wall, and then slowly back to center. Now I'm going to do this about 2 or 3 times, just to make sure I've got a nice compressed base. This will keep the bottom of my pot from cracking when it goes through the firing process. All right, I got the base all compressed. We're ready to move on to step 4. All right, so for step 4, this is my favorite step. I call this the volcano. And its main purpose is to get this mass of clay and start moving it in the upward direction. I'm not so much worried about shape or height. All I'm really worried about is getting this mass and kind of shifting it so it's starting to move up. That way I'm not trying to move too much clay all in one pull. So the way I do this is I'll take my left hand, my pointer finger, and I'm going to point almost like I'm pointing at my right foot, right? And I'm just going to let that hand gently sit right on the inside of the pot. And then I'm going to take my right hand with my sponge. I'll take the top of my finger and I'm going to press down on the back, right? This allows me to shift and turn my hand into position to get underneath the clay. And then very gently, with a little bit of force, I'm going to press that clay right up the side of my inside finger. So my inside finger is not moving. It stays down where it is. The clay just rises up the side of my finger. So really what's happening is I take the clay from here, I rotate, lift up the side of my finger. Alright, now I've completed step 4. On to step 5. Step 5 in the throwing process, this is where I actually start to lift the walls of the clay and try to get the height that's desired. So I do this by what I call the butterfly, right? So I'm going to take my thumbs, I'm going to cross them like this. I'll take my fingers, close them, wrists up above the tip of my fingers, leaning forward. All right, and so what's going to happen is I'm going to pinch the clay between these two fingers, lock my fingers in position, and lift with my arms, right? It's really important that I lift with my arms as opposed with my fingers, because if I lift with my fingers, that natural motion is for my fingers to come to a point. So what will happen is about halfway up the pot, it'll get really thin, and it'll just break off on me. This is a very common mistake that a lot of people make. So it goes from really thick to really thin to really thick, right? So we want to avoid that by keeping our fingers steady and lifting with our arms to try to keep a nice, even wall. And that is what we are after. So, I tend to use my middle fingers. So you'll see me with my hands touching, my fingers all the way down in, and using my middle fingers to start to lift the clay. Now before I start to lift, I'm going to create a groove at the very bottom. So you notice how the clay is starting to lift up a little bit, and I've kind of created this groove down here. This allows a place for my fingers to kind of wedge in. I recommend creating that groove before you start to lift up, and that will allow you to really get underneath the clay. A lot of times what happens is people just go ahead and start doing their pulls, and they just pull and pull, and next thing you know, they've got these really thick bases where all this clay is trapped down here, which later in time they have to go back and trim off. And it's mainly because this step right here for the volcano, and they don't really get underneath the clay all the way to be able to get it up into the wall of the pot. So this will really allow you to use the clay to its maximum potential. Alright, so now I've got my groove created. I'm going to lock my fingers in position, and nice and slowly, I'm going to lift with my arms, keeping my fingers steady. And I want to make sure that I lift all the way through the rim. Notice I'm keeping my fingers separated. That's just a really good habit to get into, and it keeps your fingers from jumping together right at the tip and creating this very weak rim that's liable to break. Remember, the goal is to keep the thickness of the clay the same all the way up. And so I'll just repeat this process about 2 or 3 times until I get the desired height. Create my groove at the base, lock my fingers in position, and nice and slow, lift with my arms. Lifting all the way through the rim. Very slow. Nice and steady. No sudden movements. Now you'll notice every time I complete a throw, I'll go back and gently kind of compress my rim a little bit. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my sponge, pressing it between my thumb and these two fingers to allow the sponge just to gently kind of wrap around the rim. And this just kind of keeps the rim of the pot manageable as I go through each step. And every once in a while you might check the bottom of your pot. And if it's starting to fill up with water, you're going to want to take your sponge, fold it in half, and just very gently hold it at the very bottom and let the wheel do all the work. You don't have to try to move the sponge around. Just hold it in the bottom, gently come back out, and it soaks up the majority of the water. That'll help me from keep getting the pot waterlogged, which will cause it to fall eventually. Alright, so I've completed step 5. I've gotten the maximum amount of height that I want to get with this specific piece, which brings me to move on to step 6. Now step 6 for me is all about shaping the pot. So this is at the time where I'm going to start thinking about the type of shape that I want to make. Right? Now the reason I wait until this stage is because everything that we make derives from some form of a cylinder. Whether it's a plate, bowl, cup, mug, pitcher, it doesn't matter. It all derives from some form of a cylinder. So I get the cylinder to the height that I want, and then I start to shape it. Now the way I start to shape the walls of the pot has mostly to do with my finger positioning, right? So if my fingers are side by side and I'm lifting straight up, naturally the wall wants to come straight up. Now, if my inside hand is slightly above my outside hand, naturally, the walls of the pot are going to want to come out. Now, vice versa, if my outside hand is slightly above my inside hand as I'm lifting up, the walls are going to naturally want to go in. So I can use this reference in deciding where my hand position is going to be to create the shape that's desired. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to flare this out a little bit and then flare out the top. Nice little simple flower vase shape. So I'll start at the bottom. Want to make sure I add a little bit of water. Again, I'm going to create my groove. Now my inside hand is slightly above my outside hand as I'm lifting up. Now they're going to shift. Now my outside hand is above my inside hand. They're going to shift again. Now my inside hand is above my outside hand. And that just creates a very nice, simple, basic shape. So that's really kind of the basics of shaping the pot. Which now, that brings me to step 7, the final step. And this is where I go and trim the base of my pot. So I'm going to take my wood tool and I kind of hold it like a pencil. And what's going to happen is I'm going to cut straight down at an angle and then come straight back out. Just trim off this excess bit of clay. Has anyone played Operation before? So the goal is not to hit the sides, right? So again, I'm going to brace my hands. I go in at kind of a high angle. And nice and slow. I'm going to go straight down. All the way to the bat. Hold it steady for a minute. And then gently straight back out that exact same angle. It's very important that I don't deviate left to right because it'll just shred the clay. Then finally, I'm going to take my needle tool, go down in that same angle. I'm going to lay it flat, spin the wheel 1 rotation, and then I can just gently remove that excess clay of my trimmings. And to finish off my trimming, I'll take my sponge, just gently hold it down here at the base to kind of clean up. And I have just completed a pot. Steps 1 through 7, the basics of wheel throwing. All right, guys. Till next time, Harry the Potter, signing out.